When I talk about startups, I'm talking about the kind of companies that I have experience with from my role at Union Square Ventures as a venture investor. These are companies that build products or services that are technologically enabled. That is, as opposed to human services like a consulting service or a physical therapy service. And the second characteristic is they're designed to grow fast, which is also usually why they need to raise financial capital. You should keep that in mind when you think about the advice that I'm giving, because if you're starting, let's say, a restaurant, not all of my advice may apply to it. The very first thing you need is an idea. What is your company going to do? Where do good startup ideas come from? In my experience, there are different sources of great startup ideas, and then there's some ways that are not so great at coming up with a startup idea. The easiest one is what I call scratch your own itch. It's literally a product that you want to and are going to use yourself. And somehow you're frustrated by that product not existing or not in the form that you want it to exist. A great example of that is a company that I actually helped build called Delicious. Joshua Schachter was working at Morgan Stanley, and he was somebody who bookmarked a lot of things on the internet. And he was very frustrated by the fact that not only was it impossible to find your own bookmarks inside the browser, but also they were inside your browser on one specific machine, and if you were at home, you didn't have those bookmarks. Also, lots and lots of people are bookmarking things, and why can't we see what they're bookmarking so that we know what's interesting on a particular topic? So those are all things that Joshua wanted for himself, and so he built Delicious to do exactly those things. And he had a service up and running before he even had a company. In order for Union Square Ventures to invest, Delicious, the company, actually had to be incorporated first. So this is a classic example of scratch your own itch, and it was quite successful. After Union Square Ventures invested in it, Yahoo acquired it. Unfortunately, Yahoo didn't do a great job maintaining that wonderful service. The second great way of coming up with a startup idea is to have a clearly identified need. A good example of that is Etsy. The founders of Etsy were actually building a community website for the crafting community as a service project for somebody else. Somebody else was paying them to build this community website. And as they did that, they realized that one of the things that a lot of people in that community were talking about was how they didn't like selling on eBay and how there wasn't a venue where you could just sell handmade or craft goods. And so they, through this other project that they were doing, came to realize this need. And they came to understand how big a need this was. And then they built Etsy to meet that clearly identified need. Another example that's similar is Twilio. Jeff Lawson was actually building a store, a physical retail store for skateboard equipment. And he was a programmer, though, by training. And one of the things that frustrated him to no end was the telephony system, trying to program a phone tree, trying to make the number roll over to different numbers depending on who was supposed to be answering calls. And it all seemed very arcane and hard to do and expensive. And that's how Jeff identified the need for a programmable phone number. And that was the first product that Twilio offered. A third great source of startup ideas is actually failure. What I mean by that is you are actually working at a company that's trying to solve a problem, and it's not quite solving it, and you have a better idea for how to solve that problem. Or you're working at a company that's solving a problem, but because all companies can do only so much, there's an immediately adjacent problem that the company doesn't have the resources to solve, but you understand it incredibly well and that you can go solve it. A good example of that is we were investors in a company called Takoda that was started by Dave Morgan. It was a company in the early days of internet advertising. Dave had built a prior company in advertising that had been acquired, and after the acquisition, they weren't able to invest in new product development, and he saw some clear needs for different ways of targeting advertising that wasn't being met. And so he started Takoda to address that targeting need. Another example where something was born out of the limitations and the sort of failure of the existing vendors is Stripe, which is a very large company today. People were able to accept credit cards on the internet before Stripe, but all those prior payment gateways were very, very difficult to program. And they required a separate merchant agreement, which was a long process by which you had to apply, and it took days, sometimes weeks, to be approved. And what Stripe did is basically created a very clean API and did away with the merchant agreement. That way, people could literally get started overnight instead. So again, they looked at what was out there, they saw how limited it was, and they developed something that was much, much better along several different dimensions. One of the potential sources of startup ideas are actual technological breakthroughs. An example of this is a company that we've invested in called Clarifai. Matthew was a PhD student at NYU. He built a breakthrough image recognition neural network that outperformed those of many other research teams, many of them having 20 plus researchers in them. So Matthew had come up with a breakthrough way of recognizing objects. There are many other examples of breakthrough technologies that made the foundation for a startup. The challenge with going that route is you want to be very careful to not confuse a technological breakthrough, which is a solution, with the problem. So when you have a breakthrough, you also still need to identify what the precise problem is that you want to point that breakthrough at. So while breakthroughs can be a great source of ideas, you need to take that extra step of saying, I have this amazing new thing. What can it be used for? I'm a personal investor, not through Union Square Ventures, in a startup that makes a carbon nanotube membrane. This is a breakthrough in making membranes because it can be extremely finely adjusted to what it lets through and what it filters out. But now the important next step that the company is working on is, what are the applications? What are the different problems? And what is the most immediate problem to solve with this membrane? And that's an important second step. What then are some not so good ways to come up with a startup idea? I have yet to come across a startup where somebody said, well, we did a brainstorming session and we listed 20 ideas and we sort of talked about them and we threw out various ideas and then we came up with the idea. Even people who say, I've systematically studied 20 different applications and I've come to conclude that this is the best application, this is the thing that we should build. Even that approach, which you sometimes get from people who've been in management consulting or who come out of MBA programs, often doesn't work. And why does this sort of brainstorming or mapping approach not seem to work? Well, it doesn't seem to work for the primary reason that it lacks the understanding, the deep understanding of a need. It usually operates at the surface where people go, well, this clearly seems to be broken, but it lacks the in-depth understanding of how it is broken and how it could be better, or what the missing product actually is. And so I've seen that approach often result in things that sound like they're a good idea, they sound like they should work, but once people actually start to implement them, they find that there's no real need that they're actually meeting. There's another reason why this approach, I think, is problematic. And as we go along, we will see there are many ways things can go wrong in a startup. And there can be many challenges. And if the thing you're working on, you're only working on it because it came off a list where you kind of concluded that this was going to be a successful thing, but you didn't sort of feel this need, you didn't experience it, you don't have a burning desire to solve that need, it's going to be a lot harder to be resilient in the face of all the challenges that you will have along the way. Sometimes people chase trends. They read about startups that are doing something and they go, oh, they all seem to get funded, so I'm going to do a version of that. That tends to be, not always, but it tends to be a bad way to proceed. Number one, the people who are getting funded will have been at it for quite some time already. And so you have a whole bunch of catching up to do. So unless you have a very precise way in which you think the way you're approaching it is different and better than what they're doing, you probably shouldn't chase something, because if you're chasing it, you're likely to be late. Nothing wrong with saying, hey, I'm going to build a new version of something. Like Facebook was not the first social network. There was Friendster and there was MySpace, but it was different and it started out as a different project. Chasing trends will most likely have you working on something that you're not actually passionate about yourself, and where you will likely be late relative to the people who are actually innovating. Having said all that, I am sure that there are super successful startups out there that were created exactly the way that I just said to not do it. This is a common theme. You will get a lot of advice. For almost everything, there will be exceptions to the rule, and somebody will surely have been successful with the brainstorming or mapping approach. And so don't let my saying this is not the way to do it. If that's the way you want to do it, go for it, just with the caveat as to why I thought this is a hard way of doing it. At what point in your life might you have such an idea? I don't think that there's a specific age or prerequisite. People have great ideas at all different times in their life. The question is, do you feel prepared? Do you have the skills to go execute on the idea? And what are some of those skills? Well, we'll see them in a second. They are the ability to create a minimum viable product. They are the ability to validate the idea. They are the ability to hire people that can come work with you. All those are things that you can learn on the fly, but it also helps if you've already learned them by working at another company or another startup. Overall, though, I would say when the right idea hits you, you will kind of know it. Because when the right idea hits you, you will basically not be able to think of anything else other than that idea and why you're not already working on it.